Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK proposed a UK-EU free trade area underpinned by a common rule book, including agri-food, but only for those rules necessary to provide frictionless trade at the border, and on services we seek to minimise new barriers to trade, enable UK firms to establish in the EU and continue mutual recognition of professional qualifications.
Whilst welcoming this Secretary of State to his new post, can I ask him, does he share my view that all members of this House have a sacred duty to look at the long-term future of the people that we represent? And will he join with me in looking at the front page of Financial Times, listen to the radio this morning? He knows many of our constituents working in manufacturing, working in service, are deeply, deeply distressed and worried about their future.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman. He's absolutely right. We need to look to the long term. We need to try and bridge some of the divisions in this country. And I believe that the white paper that the UK government has published is a principled, pragmatic but ambitious approach which delivers the best deal for the UK, but also makes sure that we continue our firm, strong ties with our European friends.
Mr. Damien Green.
Can I wish my right honourable friend well, particularly in the start of his negotiations this afternoon. Amidst all this talk of no deal, can he reassure me and the House that it's still the British government's intention and expectation that it will be able to reach a good deal in these negotiations?
Yes. Well, I say to my right honourable friend, he's absolutely right, and he would have seen from the white paper we've set out the approach that we're taking, the strategy that we've got. I will be out in Brussels today because we do need to step up the pace, the intensity, the heat of the negotiations, but at the same time it is the only responsible thing for the government to do to prepare for all eventualities out of these negotiations.
Mr. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State will be only too well aware that without an agreement on a backstop for the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, there will be no withdrawal agreement. Now, when the government last month published its technical note on customs arrangements, it was only half a backstop because the paper itself acknowledged it would need to have added to it something on regulation. Now that the government has committed to a common rule book in the white paper, can the Secretary of State today confirm that that will now be added to the proposal for a backstop so that he can make progress on it?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right to talk about both the progress that we've made, undoubtedly, with our European friends on the withdrawal agreement, but also that there are issues like Northern Ireland which remain to be resolved properly. And he's also right to say that the white paper and the proposals are both a principled but a flexible approach which will allow us to make sure we continue not just the frictionless trade, but avoid any issues at the border. We'll obviously take forward those negotiations today, and I look forward to discussing it with Michel Barnier later.
Rachel Maskell. Rachel McLean. I do beg the honourable lady's pardon, and I beg the honourable lady's pardon. They're both very distinctive, and it's my fuzzy memory and not their lack of distinctiveness. I do apologise to both of them. Rachel.
Well, thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And it's obviously flattering to be confused with the Honourable Lady for York. However, my constituents voted to leave the EU because they did not want our laws to be made by bureaucrats in Brussels. They want our laws to be made by our own country. So can the Secretary of State, who I know also shares this ambition, reassure my constituents that the Chequers proposal will allow our laws to be made in our country after we leave the EU?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. We have made a narrow exception where there will be a common rule book for agricultural goods and manufactured goods at the border, but only in relation to only to the extent that that's necessary to ensure frictionless trade. And even there, this House, elected members in this House, will have the last word. And of course, the UK Supreme Court will finally do what it says in the tin, which will have the last word on the application of the laws of the land.
Matthew Pennycook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Fears that the schism at the heart of the Tory party is driving the country towards a no-deal Brexit are once again on the rise, and it's clear the new Secretary of State is stepping up preparations for such a scenario. Can he therefore tell the House what specific advice his department are giving to the financial services sector on how to prepare for an EU departure without a deal?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman. Of course, many of the banks and those in the city are already preparing and are very confident they can withstand any of the uncertainty in relation to Brexit negotiations. We have been preparing for some time now, and I pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Wickham, all the preparatory work that he has done. But we will be starting to step up some of those preparations, and some of it will become more publicly facing in the weeks and months ahead, and that's necessary, and any responsible government would have to do it. We will obviously set out the details of that shortly.
Sir Desmond Sway.
But all our manufactures will have to be produced in full accordance with the acquis, won't they?
Well, I understand his concern about this, but it's only, the common rule book is only in relation to those particular rules that relate to the border to avoid frictionless trade. We will make sure through technical level consultations that we have a voice in the formation of those rules, and ultimately it will be for this House to say yes or no to whether those rules become the law of the land.
And Mr. Peter Heaton-Jones.
Question number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will answer questions 2 and 11 together. We work closely with the Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs on farming support. The Government will provide the same cash total in funds for farm support until the end of the Parliament, maintaining stability for farmers as we grow our world-leading food and farming industry in a sustainable way.
Mr. Peter Heaton-Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my right honourable friend confirm that it's the Government's policy that we will leave the customs union, leave the single market, leave the common fisheries policy and leave the common agricultural policy, and that the government is committed that under that new framework North Devon's farmers will continue to thrive outside the EU?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and indeed our white paper confirms that the United Kingdom will leave the single market and the customs union. Outside of the CAP and the CFP, will be free to develop a domestic agriculture policy that works in the best interest of farmers in North Devon, across the UK, and at the same time will become an independent coastal state with full control over our waters.
Order. I've just been advised that the Honourable Lady, the Member for Cheltenham, is not here. She's not yet been able to access the building, but if she gets here later, I will try to accommodate her, but it means that for the time being the grouping falls. Rachel Maskell.
I'm most grateful, Mr. Speaker. The Chemical Regulation Division of the Health and Safety Executive regulates biocides and pesticides under the EU REACH regulations. These pesticides have to be tested within the EU. So on the 29th of March 2019, we will lose this work. So will the government buy into the new replaced EU body, losing 300 jobs in York and Bootle? Or will it be forced into having separate EU testing, placing additional costs on farmers?
Well, obviously this is subject to negotiation, but I understand the concern that the Honourable Lady has raised. We will be seeking to pursue a relationship whereby we are engaged with the regulatory structures in Europe to make sure we have continuity and stability in that sector.
Stephen Gethins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can I firstly congratulate the Cabinet Secretary on his elevation to Cabinet. There are a number of leavers who suggest that the governing classes or the establishment are calling the shots on Brexit, and that's why it's such a mess. If farmers in my constituency want to know who's calling the shots, is it the Cabinet Secretary?
Hear, hear.
No, I say to the honourable gentleman, it's the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, and I will be deputising for the Prime Minister in these negotiations, and I'll be out seeing Michel Barnier shortly, and I hope that I can attest to his full support for the White Paper.
And Jenny Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not so long ago, the Secretary of State, in a burst of youthful exuberance, published a blog. It included his 10 policies, it wasn't that racy, for his 10 policies for a better Britain. Policy number 7 said, we need to deregulate the common market. Does he still agree with his own manifesto for Britain?
Well, what I'll say to the Honourable Lady is in all of those areas, as important as they are, and whatever the different views across this House on those very sensitive matters, the crucial thing is that elected members in this House have the last word on the laws of the land. And I share her concern about those areas. I share her interest. Why on earth would she want to abdicate responsibility for lawmaking to Brussels when we need to be in this House accountable to our constituents?
Jenny Chapman.
Mr. Speaker, for British farmers to trade successfully with Europe, we must remain on the same level playing field with common standards and regulations. Yep. The President of the National Farmers Union said earlier this year that the floor is for our standards to be in line with the rest of Europe. So does the Secretary of State agree with the Farmers Union or with himself?
Well, I think he's welcomed the White Paper, but what I would just she's welcomed the White Paper. What I would say to the Honourable Lady is the CAP's land-based subsidy and the bureaucratic structure that goes with it has held back productivity in this country. It has not delivered the scale of environmental improvement we need, and when we leave the Common Agricultural Policy, we'll make sure that we have the best agricultural but also environmental policy for this country.
Let me just say to the Honourable Lady, it was a reckless door or barrier, electronic or otherwise, that sought to prevent her access to the House. But she's with us now and we look forward to hearing her. Michelle Donnellan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your patience. Leaving the EU provides opportunities for Wiltshire farmers, hence why they voted leave. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that making our own decisions for farmers to suit farmers will ensure that their interests are best protected?
Well, I say to my honourable friend, she's absolutely right. We want a more dynamic, more self-reliant agricultural industry as we continue to compete internationally, supplying products of the very highest standard to the domestic market and increasing exports. We also want a reformed agricultural and land management policy to deliver a better and richer environment for Wiltshire and across the UK.
Indeed. Mr. Virendra Sharma.
Thank you. Question number 3, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The White Paper, published last week, makes it clear that the government is committed to high levels of social and employment protection and proposes a reciprocal non-regression requirement for domestic labour standards. The paper also proposes a mutual commitment to individual rights, noting that the UK will remain a party to the ECHR after it has left the EU. This is also reflected in the EU Withdrawal Act, which maintains existing rights protection as part of EU retained law.
Virendra Sharma.
Thank you very much for your response. In 2009, the Secretary of State said that he did not believe in economic and social rights. How can he guarantee that he will not use Brexit as an excuse to slash protections for minorities and workers?
Minister. Well, I think the Secretary of State is experienced and has a proven track record, not only as a Justice Minister, but also as a lawyer. And any attempt to undermine his credentials and commitment to the rule of law, civil liberties, and now delivering a successful Brexit is fundamentally misguided. The government has made clear, not just in the White Paper, but also on numerous occasions during the passage of the EU Withdrawal Act, that leaving the EU does not mean a diminution of human rights.
Marcus Fish.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our right honourable friend earlier referred to the common rule book being mooted as being very narrow, but actually when you look at what's necessary for free circulation, it's actually extremely wide. And I'm concerned that the parliamentary lock that's in the White Paper is actually unworkable, because there'll be the sword of Damocles of a hard border in Ireland should we derogate from any of it. Does she remember that decades of Conservative manifestos have committed to retaining or increasing our autonomy over regulations such as these?
I thank my honourable friend for his comments, and I know what an indefatigable campaigner he is for the UK leaving the European Union, and his expertise on this issue is well known. At the end of the day, the Common Rule Book is going to be subject to a parliamentary lock, and it is also reflective of rules on goods which haven't changed for many decades.
Blomfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister rightly points out the White Paper proposes non-regression clauses on environmental regulation, social and employment protections. But in 2016, the Secretary of State wrote in the Times that Brexit was an opportunity to, and I quote, ditch the 100 most burdensome EU regulations, taking exception to the agency workers' regulations, for example, on the grounds, and I quote again, it gives agency workers the right to the same basic employment and working conditions as full-time staff. Now, does the Minister agree with the White Paper, or with her Secretary of State?
The government has been clear in the White Paper that our commitment to rights protections is unequivocal, and that it will be ultimately a decision for Parliament on how those rules are applied. May I remind him that rights don't emanate from the EU. We have our own rich and proud tradition of civil liberties, whether it's the Race Relations Act of 1965 or the Equal Pay Act of 1970, critical pieces of legislation to which we acceded before our accession to the EEC.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for calling me. And while I understand my honourable friend's position on guaranteeing UK rights, and in fact I respect the position that she's holding, which is that UK rights need no foreign courts to guarantee them, perhaps she could help me understand how she views the rights of others on our continent, because of course the great achievement of many of our people in the last 50 years was the extension of those rights. And when I see lists of Jews being suggested in Vienna, and when I hear of the erosion of the rule of law in other parts of Eastern Europe, what does she think this government's position on making sure those rights still exist will still be?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. As I said, we have a long and proud tradition which predates our membership of the EU to protecting civil liberties, upholding human rights and enhancing the position of the individual, whether that's through the rule of law or our commitment to the ECHR. And Brexit won't change that.
John Whittingdale.
Number 4, sir.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 4, 16 and 18 together. On the 19th of June, we published a joint statement on the draft withdrawal agreement setting out our progress in agreeing the text on the majority of separation issues. Negotiations are ongoing and my officials are in Brussels, and of course with last week's publication of the White Paper, we hope to intensify negotiations on the future relationship.
Does my right friend agree that the financial settlement contained in the withdrawal agreement is one of our strongest bargaining cards? And will he therefore include within the bill provisions to make sure that its full payment is conditional on our achieving a satisfactory outcome to negotiations?
Well, as ever, my right honourable friend makes a powerful point. As the EU says, there's no deal until the whole deal is concluded. The withdrawal agreement must come alongside a framework for the future partnership agreement. Article 50 requires it, and if one side of the deal is not met, if one side of the deal, one party does not meet its side of the bargain, it would inevitably have consequences for the deal as a whole.
Huddleston. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State will be aware that the UK has a near £70 billion trade deficit with the EU. It's transparently in their interest to get a deal that keeps trade flowing. Is he aware if European businesses and companies are lobbying the EU negotiators and EU governments to make sure that we do get a mutually beneficial deal?
Well, my honourable friend's right, and the government has a regular and productive dialogue with the European business community itself. And in those discussions, we highlight our common interests with those businesses, and it's important that their voice is heard, because there's a lot at stake, not just for UK businesses and jobs, but also for European businesses and jobs.
Stephen Metcalfe. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that remaining inside the customs union or the single market would be a breach of the outcome of the referendum and totally undermine the trust of the British people?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. And not only would it be a breach of the referendum, but every honourable member, at least on this side of the House, went into the last election promising our constituents that we will leave the customs union and the single market. The crucial thing which this white paper does is forge a plan which can deliver on that whilst maintaining the strong relationship we want with our European friends.
Mrs. Ellen Goodman.
Speaker, PPG in my constituency provides 200 jobs, and they tell me that if we leave the Chemicals Agency, they will have to close. So will the Secretary of State commit to the Common Rule Book and not making any compromises on that part of the White Paper?
Well, the Honourable Lady is right to point to this, but she's also cited the White Paper, so she will know that we're committed to staying with a strong regulatory relationship with our EU partners for precisely the reasons that she made.
Nick Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given so many of his friends and colleagues want to bring down the Prime Minister, how's the Brexit Secretary going to get his withdrawal agreement through in the autumn?
Well, the same way we got the customs bill through this week, which is working hard, listening to all sides, and delivering for the people of the United Kingdom.
James Shannon.
My constituency of Strangford depends very much on the agri-food sector for employment, for jobs opportunities as well. With reference to the border in Northern Ireland, can the Minister explain how he intends to foster cross-border trade in a safe and effective way?
Well, the honourable gentleman will know from the White Paper that we've set out a paradigm which works not just for trade between the UK and the EU, but specifically will avoid any return to the hard border in Northern Ireland. We now need to take that proposal to our European friends. I'll be seeing Michel Barnier later on this afternoon, and I'll be sure to convey the concerns that he's expressed in this House.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 5, please.
The Department for Exiting the European Union is working closely with the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport in order to understand the complexities of the issue relating to broadcasting, and together we are listening to the international broadcasting sector to understand their needs and concerns. I myself was very pleased to address the Creative Industries Federation in March.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much. Is the Minister aware that the Commercial Broadcasters Association has expressed its concern about the lack of clarity in the government's proposals post-Brexit, particularly for the international TV channels based in the UK, currently worth more than £1 billion to the economy and providing 1 in 5 jobs in the broadcasting sector? At the moment, UK-based international TV channels have a licence for the rest of the EU. The Commercial Broadcasters Association is concerned that it's not clear if this will continue. We are already seeing international broadcasters moving, so what steps can the government assure us that they are taking?
Well, the Prime Minister's Mansion House speech committed to exploring creative options with an open mind to replace the country of origin principle enshrined in the AVMSD. And the UK's position represents the best, credible proposal for the future relationship. It reflects the EU's aim, as stated in the Council guidelines, of allowing market access to provide services under host state rules.
The honourable member for Bristol West is leaping to her feet with a vigour and enthusiasm which remind me of my younger self. Thangham Debonair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that the advice that the government now seems to be hinting at for businesses to prepare for a no-deal situation looks an awful lot like the consequences that we Remainers were criticised for during the referendum as Project Fear, does the Minister understand why the creative and digital industries in my constituency, of which there are many, do not trust this government to negotiate on their behalf one little bit?
Very creative.
Well, I know how experienced the Honourable Lady is in this sector, in the arts, and the White Paper proposes new arrangements for services and the creative sector and the digital sector, recognising that the UK and the EU will not have the current levels of access to each other's markets. That includes, the EU and the UK included broadcasting in the joint list of topics for discussion in the future framework, which reflects our shared understanding of the importance of the sector as a whole. It's obviously the responsible duty of the government to prepare for all outcomes.
Ahmed Yassin.
Number 6, please, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK has a long-standing tradition of ensuring our rights and liberties are protected domestically and of promoting high standards across a range of issues on the international stage. The EU Withdrawal Act will ensure that wherever practical, the same rights, standards and protections apply after exit, and we will not engage in a race to the bottom in the standards and protections we set.
Mohamed Yassi.
Thank you. The recent white paper committed the UK to membership of ECHR. Can the Minister confirm that the Human Rights Act, which put it into domestic law, embodies the commitment to the people in the UK and our European partners? Yes.
Well done. Alison Thewlis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the most tangible benefits of the EU for my constituents is being able to travel across the EU and not have to pay roaming charges on mobile phones. Will the Minister guarantee that once we leave the EU, my constituents will still be able to travel and not be charged for roaming charges?
The Honourable Lady raises an interesting point, which I don't see as how it is related to rights, standards and protections, but I would say to her, of course, this is a matter that we will be discussing with the commercial operations in the sector, and I believe it is in the interest, and a number of the key UK providers have already said that they don't intend to apply roaming charges.
Mr. Peterbone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The question relates to when we leave the EU, and
I have a little digital thing on my phone that says we're going to leave in 253 days' time. But, Mr. Speaker, there's been a lot of talk today in the media about the government considering extending Article 50 and the exit date. Would the superb Minister lay that rumour to rest and confirm that the Prime Minister is going to stick to her guns and we're going to leave on the 29th of March next year?
I'm very happy to reassure my honourable friend, as it says in the EU Withdrawal Act and as it's clear in the White Paper, that we are going to leave on the 29th of March next year.
Diana Johnson.
Can I just say to the Minister that the European arrest warrant is a protection, and when we leave the EU, can he just update us on whether the negotiated position that his government will arrive at with the EU will give us the same protections as we currently have to arrest and detain criminals, which my constituents are really concerned about?
I'd say to the Honourable Lady that we are very clear in the security partnership section of the White Paper that we are seeking the same levels of protection, and we're seeking to engage with the EU on how these issues can be arranged between us so that we maintain those protections that we have now.
Sandy Martin.
Number 7, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I will answer questions 7 and 17 together. The White Paper sets out a comprehensive vision for our partnership with the EU. For services, our ambitious and credible proposals include guaranteeing suppliers and investors can operate across a broad number of sectors, enabling firms to establish to provide cross-border services, ensuring professionals continue to get their qualifications recognised, and a new economic and regulatory partnership for financial services.
Andy Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Successive British governments expended significant effort and time in negotiating a single market in services in the EU, achieving a 40% increase in services exports since 2010 as a result. How long does the Minister think it will take to negotiate a similarly open market in services with other parts of the world? And what does he suggest my constituents working in insurance and IT do in the meantime?
I'd say to the Honourable Gentleman, we have set out in the White Paper a number of proposals for the services sector as to how we can maintain those benefits, but we also have been growing our services trade with the rest of the world. He mentioned a 40% growth in trade with the EU. There's been a 70% growth in UK services exports to countries outside the EU over the last decade. So I think our UK services industry is world-leading and will continue to be as we go through this process.
Tom Brake.
In preparing for negotiations, a responsible government would establish the impact on the services sector of both the Chequers Agreement and no deal. So will the Minister confirm how the profitability, job creation potential and ability to export to the EU of the services sector would be affected if either the Chequers proposals or no deal were reached with the European Union?
Minister.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman will know that the UK has a world-leading services sector, as we've just discussed. It is exporting to both the EU and the rest of the world very successfully, and the single market in services, sadly, was never actually completed. So I think our services sector will remain hugely profitable and a huge success story for the UK throughout this process.
Pardon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The White Paper says repeatedly that on services which make up 80% of the UK economy, the government's proposals will mean less market access for UK businesses to European markets compared with at present. Has the government made an assessment of the impact of this lower market access, either in terms of the volume of trade or the impact on jobs?
Not at all. As the Honourable Gentleman will know, we've been engaging with businesses across the whole economy, and of course that includes our world-leading services sector. What is very clear, though, is that the advantages that make that services sector world-leading are created here in the UK. We will make sure that that services sector has the right arrangements to continue to do business within Europe, to continue to have qualifications recognised, but of course we are leaving the single market, and there will be changes as a result of that.
Number 8.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer questions 8, 20 and 23 together. We have made significant progress in negotiations and are confident that we will secure a deal with the European Union. However, as a responsible government, we are continuing to prepare for all possible outcomes.
Martin Day.
Thank you. There has been recent press speculation that the Government is considering emergency measures which would include the stockpiling of food and medicines. Can the Minister confirm if that is accurate, and if so, what would be the distribution proposals for those stockpiles?
Department's plans are well developed and are designed to respond to all scenarios, including the unlikely possibility that we'll leave the EU without a deal. Some contingency plans have already become evident, and more will become public over the coming weeks.
Charles Watling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If, in the end, there is no deal, can my honourable friend assure me that the government's contingency plans will take into account often overlooked areas like Clacton?
Yes, Clacton, Mr. Speaker, is never overlooked by its Member of Parliament. The government is engaging with businesses and other stakeholders in every region of the United Kingdom to understand the challenges and opportunities that may impact them. We will be consulting later this year on the new UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which will give us the opportunity to consider carefully how we address barriers to growth, tackle inequalities faced by all areas of the country, including rural and coastal areas like my right honourable friend's constituency of Clacton.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's own analysis shows that no deal will be a financial disaster, and this week the Bank of England Governor warned that a no-deal Brexit would have big economic consequences for the UK. Now, the White Paper was a sham, just talking about exploring options. Does he agree the government needs to actually do a lot more than explore options, work hard and get a deal, rather than face up this no-deal scenario?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and obviously, we would much prefer to have a very good deal with the European Union than not, and so that's why all the work, most of the work in my department is focused on that. But we do have to prepare for every scenario, and I'd like to finish off the gentleman that the honourable gentleman quoted by saying that the financial consequences for the EU would be far greater.
Steve Baker.
Mr. Speaker, I congratulate my honourable friend on his new position. There's absolutely no one that I would rather see in his job at this time, and I wish him every possible success. Can I say to him that papers available to him will show that as long ago as October I was seeking to create a parliamentary moment to galvanise all of government to prepare not only for the unwanted contingency of no deal, but for all scenarios, including the end of the implementation period. Will he now use this collective agreement reached at Chequers to go out and galvanise the whole of government to deliver, knowing that it's not something that DEXU can direct? It will require the very top of government to mobilise every department.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for his question and for leaving me an unbelievable quantity of reading to do because of the diligent way in which he prepared for every scenario, as he rightly says.
Mr. Peter Grant.